All right. So I'm sitting here with John Trefry. John Trefry is the author of Thy Decay Thou Seest by Thy Desire, Plats, a novel, Apparitions of the Living, and forthcoming, about to start shipping or something, right? Massive. John started out in the DIY hardcore community, hardcore punk community, moved on to architecture for a little while, and then now, to my understanding, you're teaching architecture as well as publishing literature in the expanded field. Is that right?
Yeah, it's kind of funny to say you started out in DIY punk and then went into architecture. Like that was my my education for architecture was like going to house shows and stuff.
I think it's relative. I mean, for years, I dropped out of high school twice, so I never thought that I'd be going to any form of university, let alone teaching now. And at this point, whenever I've spoken with students or whoever, it's always a matter of, well, I received my initial education from just going to sweaty shows and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's hard to leave that behind if you took it seriously at the time, which I did. Um, it is still part of my intellectual life, I think.
Well, I would say so. I think a lot of the when I was first meeting you online, I think a lot of our earlier discussions were not only about like the KLF, which has like an adjacency there.
Right.
Yeah, that sounds good.
But it's there.
Yes. It's funny because just a quick anecdote. I recently I'm having students do these like wind down journals, and I had a student who was like something like, my preconceptions about how professors dress and the rhetorical decisions behind that has been altered by this class. And I was sitting there thinking, I was like, I dressed really nice the first day of class, and then I counterbalanced that recently with like a Napalm Death shirt. So
There you go.
yeah, but let's get into it. So you are this whole class I kind of base around this idea that we have largely in comp studies, multimodality. So, as someone with a background in architecture, how do you think about storytelling beyond just words? Does your experience with design and space influence how you incorporate multimodal elements into your writing, like visuals or even the structure of the book itself?
Mm, storytelling is not something that is a concern of of mine, especially whether it's because it's something I'm not good at,
Mhm.
um, or if it's something that conceptually or intellectually just doesn't interest me. Um, I think I kind of rely on the latter as a maybe an excuse for myself to not have to worry about it if I'm not good at it. But it's never like as I started working on with text as a writer, um, it's just not something that came naturally out of me as like an urge to tell things um, and to construct scenarios that like had causality to them, which seems like it has a lot to do with storytelling. And I think to the question of like an interdisciplinary multimodality, architecture has really established a way of thinking about literature for me. And I think it has to do with initially with my education as an architect, but also my practice as an architect. Because when I originally started out in school, I had this sense, and I remember like all the way through college, essentially. I remember my final project in college talking about it in terms of like the building making people do certain things. Like um, choreographing kind of movement sequences through spaces, and suggesting that the building had some kind of control over people, which they do loosely. But as I got into graduate school, which was my education, my master's degree was at SciArc in Los Angeles, which is a much more heady school. It's a freestanding architecture school that doesn't have any kind of institutional relationship with a university or anything. So it was kind of out there. It was in a warehouse in Marina Del Rey. So I did one building project in 2.5 years, and the rest were they were architecture, but they were more questioning what architecture was capable of and whether architecture had to be a building and all of these things. And then when I started practicing, I had loosed myself a lot from, I think, what my expectations were about what architecture was capable of, and realized that people's engagement with it is very passive and ambivalent, and that you can't make someone feel or do anything. You can only establish the framework within which they are going to experience their lives, like on the trajectory that they were already on. There's certainly like functional things that you can have some sway over, but to think that that you're going to create like this static, objective, universal vision for how people engage with the world was just really, it became apparent to me that that was not the case. And as I was leaving graduate school and starting to practice, I got opened up to a lot of like the French new novelists of the 20th century, and thinking about the fluidity of what text is capable of in a book. And so I think around that time, I just started making the connection between buildings and their kind of passive, inert otherness from our experience, and the things that I was reading from Michel Butor and Rob Grillet and all those guys, that a book was also capable of being like a building, and that it's inert and separate from you, and there for you to activate or not activate, or to ignore, or to manipulate in some way. So that doesn't answer your question about like how I think about text and images and all that stuff. It's more of just like a foundation of what I think a book is, or my project with books.
I think it's all relative, and but really what you're speaking to is the framework that I've tried to impart on a lot of the students that I'm working in right now. And it's really inspiring to see what a high school kid going into a first year composition classroom, because I don't teach English, but rather composition. So even reviewing some of the entries we've had recently on like how is your writing changed over the last couple of months, and a lot of students have spoken similarly to that realization that narrative building or storytelling in any form doesn't need to be linear, and it doesn't need to be rooted in these sort of like foundational concepts that we learn from our initial education. Because the thing that the university that I'm teaching at right now has going quite different from a lot is our composition program is completely divorced from the English program.
Hmm.
So the two ideas, the two disciplines are handled rather differently, and they both play to their strengths, which I appreciate. And even within that, I have right now a mechanical engineering student who's become far more interested in the creative writing possibilities of our class space. And even then, I mean, we're discussing things like, okay, well, you can take these principles you're learning from engineering and apply it to writing. We can look at hypertexts. We can look at sort of what was going on with the earlier MacBooks and everything like that. And even yesterday, having a discussion with another student about language variation and linguistic diversity and considering things like HTML coding, CSS coding, and having these foundations that we learn through our education, but focusing more on what skills we take away from it. And I think you're speaking to sort of how you approach publishing, because from what I've noticed, everything you do amplifying other authorial voices and stuff like that. There's a vibe there, but it's all distinct and it's all unique to what I would say is your interest in the book more as an object rather than capital L literature. So that brings us to multimodality in DIY publishing. Inside the Castle, your imprint publishes books that experiment not just with language, but also with form, layout, and design. Do you think multimodality plays a role in DIY publishing as compared to like Random House or Penguin, where authors then have more control over how their work is presented visually and structurally? In saying this distinction does not seek out a commentary on the state of publishing per se, but I'm eager to hear it anyways. But that is to say, I'm more curious about how you might view the power and dynamics of authorship and whether that freedom to work in multimodal environments figures into your practice.
Yeah, it definitely has to do with freedom. Because I would say, to preface everything, I have no stakes. Like there are no stakes whatsoever in what I do, and a corporation has stakes. They have shareholders, they've got contracts, they've got, I don't even fucking know what a corporation has to deal with. I don't have to deal with it. I'm just like me and Mike Correo, who I work with on Inside the Castle now. We just do what we feel is right for our project. And um, the fact that I have no stakes means that I can make decisions that are inventive and that um, are not calculated against any kind of financial concerns. So on top of that, even like reduce the amount of uh, overhead or whatever that I might have to deal with, I use print on demand for everything. So when I'm talking to someone about a book and collaborating with them to imagine how it might come into being, whether it's like taking a manuscript that's just text and trying to imagine if that text could evolve in some way to become something else, because a manuscript on a computer is not a book. There's an element of translation that is involved with bringing a Word doc into a book form, understanding like where you have page breaks, even like on a text is like, it seems pretty straightforward, but it has a function that allows people to receive the text in a way that they would not if they're scrolling through a Word doc. So when I'm having those conversations with people collaboratively, hopefully, about how that translation process takes place, there's no limits to what that translation might look like. And it calls into question all these things that you're talking about, like the shape of the book, like the literal shape of the book, its aspect ratio, its thickness. Um, it calls into question whether it is going to be in color or it's just black and white, typefaces, all of these things. There's no predetermination based on the constraints of my business model or whatever. It's always like what is going to be right for the book. And on top of that, and it's probably not like healthy for me to do this, but I personally am also not concerned about whether I sell a lot of the books. To me, it is all about the process of making. And that kind of goes back to architecture a little bit because, for the most part, architects do not spend time with their buildings after they're done with them. They write them, they draw them, and they oversee the construction in most cases, and then they're off. And so I see my entire role and my satisfaction as being derived from working on the book. Architect Peter Eisenman said something that I actually talked about in class this week, but that architecture is all of the things that the architect does, the drawing, the development of the building. The thing out in the world is a building. That is not architecture. So I see what I do, similar to being an architect, as the key thing of making this book. And then it goes out in the world, whether it sells copies or whatever is not overly a concern of mine. So again, that allows me to do something like Grant Meyerhofer's book that took me 2 years to design, that was like 800 pages of full color insanity. Probably sold like 5 copies or something. I spent like hundreds of hours on it. And it doesn't matter to me. Like, that's the real joy, is getting to spend time working on stuff. So yes, I feel free and liberated by not having constraints financially, but also free and liberated by being indulgent in a process and trying to find the most effective translation of a manuscript into a book form.
Yeah, I really appreciate the trajectory the tail end of that explication took, because you're speaking intuitively to concepts that I've been encouraging my students to consider right from the beginning of our class, which is this idea of valuing the process over the product. And I think we might be privy to that as people with backgrounds in like DIY punk or metal, where 300 units of a 7-inch record is a lot. And you end up inevitably with like a box of them stowed away in a closet somewhere after you sold like 50 and you have the
Yeah.
250 left over. And even within that, some of my pedagogical practice is more rooted in like, well, a grade is a grade. It's a numerical value that translates to a letter on the paper or on the screen these days. So focus more on what you can do in the space of the classroom where you are thinking, and et cetera, et cetera, transferable skills and all of that. So that ties in really nicely. I want to return to trying to discuss some more of your work. A lot of what and by that I mean your work as a writer rather than a designer publisher, because we have discussed a lot of like visual and textual elements in narrative crafting, and also just like visual rhetoric in those decisions. So your work often feels like a combination of different art forms, and this conversation has demonstrated that writing, architecture, visual design. considering the physicality, the literal physicality of the book form, how do you decide which elements to bring together in your books? And how do you think using multiple modes like images or spatial design can help tell a story differently than just words alone? How do you go about organizing what may or may not work for a specific project? And I ask this in part as the final project that my students are doing, at least, is developing like a portfolio website where we're now translating, in many instances, those PowerPoint presentations or those formal traditional essays into things that are more intuitive to the web interface.
Mhm. Well, I don't I don't know how like multimodal my writing practice is in terms of like the final product. Um, because I've never put an image into text in one of my books. It's just not something that as yet has felt necessary to me, or even like something that I want to do. A lot of the books that I publish have like a really um, dynamic relationship of text and image, of like a real freedom to just, I mean, even like drop a screenshot from a phone into a text, like as though it's just a paragraph or something. And for better or for worse, I'm pretty conservative about my writing practice in terms of feeling like it needs to be writing, like it needs to be text. That is my raw material that I'm working with and that I'm making something out of. Um, so I think removing like the idea of like a visual or like graphic kind of image from the equation, the variety of things that I address when I'm making one of my own books has to do a lot more with um, simple questions that I assume that most writers or publishers ask about their own books, which is like, what shape is the text block? How close does it get to the edges of the page? Um, should there be page numbers? Should there not? Should there be running titles? Should there not? What typeface should be used? What line spacing should be used? Um, so all those things seem like they are normal questions that you'd ask about like a John Grisham novel that's getting published.
Right.
Um, but I feel like maybe I ask them of myself in a different way. Um, because actually, as the person who is publishing their own writing, I think I have the advantage of considering a lot of those decisions in the process of writing a book. And I think that maybe was not overly the case with Platts, although the just calling into question the function and nature of a paragraph in the construction or composition of a book was pretty fundamental with Platts. So it had to do with like how much could fit on a page and everything. But I think the book that you alluded to that's coming out in December, Massive, um, is very, very, very um, bound up by the way it gets put together in the book. And the way that I wrote that book was utilizing, I don't know, 150 or so notepad files. So I had a folder structure with a bunch of different categories and characters. And then in those folders, there were notepad files that I would just write text in, obviously. But uh, I didn't really know how they were going to fit together. And I kind of struggled with that conceptually for a long time, whether they needed to be assembled based on some kind of um, mechanism that was outside of my authorial intent, like coming up with a mathematical thing, like counting the number of characters in each text, like typographic characters, um, and then figuring out how long each one was going to be on a page, and somehow like mathematically figuring out how to divvy everything up. Um, but what ended up taking place was actually um, a lot looser and a lot more improvisational. So just to help understand like what the book looks like, it has a standard kind of like identical on each page text block frame. In that frame on InDesign, um, each page in like sequential pages has what I would call like a running text that goes through it. So to set up a page, I would take the text block from that particular notepad file and just like run it through however many pages it was going to be and let it fill up the whole text block. And then what I would do is, based on a 3-column structure on the page layout, I would go in and drop other text blocks in with the text wrap feature turned on, so that when I drop a chunk of text from another notepad file, the running text wraps around it and
Mm.
like rejustifies itself relative to that um, little aggregate of text that I drop in there. And so it was improvisational in that I really kind of forgetting now, but I didn't have a tremendous amount of intent about which aggregation of text pieces, the text wrap blocks that I was dropping in, were going to be. I was just kind of working through it. Um, and so the end result is something that is very noisy and uh, hard to pin down. And with all the strange justifications and everything, and this was my intent, but it makes your eye not be able to read, like literally. Your eye cannot read the way that you normally would want to. Um, so that's not like using images, but it's almost like using text as a functional thing, like that. The function that it serves is to be disruptive of itself, to create a performance out of reading, so that every time somebody reads the book, you hear this, like people talking about, well, everyone reads a book and has their own experience, but for the most part, they're reading the same words in the same order. This book is impossible to read the same words in the same order between readers. And I feel like you could even um, spend a lot of time on one page, like reading it in several different ways. So to me, that's like, in my own writing practice, there's like a relationship between the way I write, the kinds of words I use, my personal diction, and um, my kind of vocabulary. But then there's also a vision of like what kind of armature or space that text gets put into in order to allow it to function in a particular way.
I really appreciate that answer, because you effectively spoke to a lot of other points that I was going to get on. And the one thing that I'll mention, the way that I appreciate you're talking about this idea of translating from the notepad file, a very non-stylized form of writing, and then translating that onto the page just for the practicality of putting the words on the book page, but then thinking even further about how you can change the reader's experience through elements like design. And obviously, in a first year composition course, as we're encouraging students to work on these personal narratives, we are encouraging them to consider, in a much more foundational sense, disrupting the notion of a traditional 5-paragraph essay
Mhm.
and disrupting the playfulness of writerly spaces, where a lot of my students have come in with a very specific way of doing things from the high school point. And I hated high school writing myself. So, but since you spoke so effectively to some of these final points, and I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, you mentioned vocabulary and diction, and I was just more curious about some of your experiences transferring from academic writer to somebody entering writerly spaces. I know I read an interview with you years ago where you mentioned attending like a writers group, and it was largely people who believed they were writing the next Harry Potter series.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I'm hoping that you can speak more to the elements of personality, experience, and if anything, you might choose to bring over or not in your writing from your own experience. A lot of what we focus on is the sort of like identity elements that we lose when we formalize writing.
Hmm. Well, I mean, I would say in terms of identity, I, as a white man, I don't feel like I have one that like is of any consequence. Um, and I, I don't know if that just like unencumbers me from feeling like I need to engage with it. But I don't know. Like some of the trans writers that I've published, like Never Angeline North, she talked to me about like some of her challenges in being a trans writer and having an expectation that she was supposed to write about being trans,
Right.
um, and she doesn't. I mean, she does because she is, but she's writing like through her own lens of her own work, and I think that not that I'm remotely as in touch with myself, but I think that's kind of the same way that I write from myself. So, I mean, Platts is like about being disembodied in Los Angeles. And that was my experience there, going to architecture school in Los Angeles. And like, as you're experiencing in graduate school, not having, um, maybe feeling disembodied because of like your relationship to time and to place is very strange. And Apparitions of the Living was about my relationship to Alain Roguelet, basically, and like it turned into a book about a neglected child being like abandoned and abused, which is how I kind of felt under his thumb. Um, so it's not like I'm writing about myself, but you can't not have it come from yourself particularly. I would say, however, that Massive is probably my first book that's like not not really about me, because those other books are they really literally are like about me and my experiences. But this was a book that had like um, an external um, armature that it was built off of, which was the life of the Russian poet Osip Mandelstam, and his primarily his life during Stalinist Russia and being sent into exile, and finally dying in a prison camp. And so there's like actual like biographical stuff about him and about his wife and other Russian poets from the same time period that I was kind of preying upon, to create, basically to give me things to write about. um, and in terms of like the diction of Massive, in a way that kind of continues to remove myself from it, although like I wrote every word of it, it's trying to give myself a linguistic lens or constraint to write through that, kind of automates me as a writer. So I'm not feeling the need to be like expressive in a particular way. So the mechanism that I used was, honestly, I don't even know where this came from. Some like spark in reading about Mandelstam, um, gave me this idea of, writing everything in the, I think it's called the present continuous tense, which is having ing at the end of all your verbs.
Oh, okay,
Uh,
yeah.
so everything is happening right now in the book. It's all like, happening at once, and that to me was, came from the concept of block time or an eternalism, that like the entirety of time is existing at once. And I'm not a physicist, I can't talk to that, so I'll leave it as far as that. But that constraint caused me to, um, if you take it really seriously, not even use nouns that are also verbs that don't have the ing at the end, that aren't in that tense. So like you can't say the word paint. You have to say like latex pigmentation or something like that, because you've given yourself this constraint. And that led to a lot of like strange jargon choices. So
Right.
if you're like trying to think of like, okay, well, how am I supposed to say this noun that is not going to work against the constraint? Well, you have to like search out a highly specific form of that noun that, that would never also be a verb. So there's lots of strange, uh, jargon kind of, vocabulary in the book. And then there was also just the, and again, I don't know quite where this came from, but the book involved a lot of list making.
Hmm.
So I made lists of like every river and its tributaries in Russia. I made a list of all the place names along the longest straight line that occurs entirely on land on Earth. I made a list of all the Emmanuel movies. Uh, I made a list of all the words in English that have the ZH sound in them. And so those things end up populating the text like in a really, noisy kind of heterogeneous way, because they're floating all over the place through these little insertions. And the end effect of all of this is that, um, the book it just doesn't even feel like I wrote it. Although I spent 8 years on it. But like when you look at it, like if you look at one line across, that's not something that I wrote. It's something that kind of happened and then happened to come onto the page. So I don't want to like, I'm not someone who wants to not write, because I love to write. It's very, very enjoyable for me. It's my favorite thing. but I don't want to like feel like I'm trying to draw from within myself anymore. Um, and in fact, the next book I'm working on is um, it's a nonfiction book about Jupiter, um, and the intention is that there will be no frame of reference relative to the Earth. So, like a lot of the things I've been doing so far have been calculating, like, what is an actual day on Jupiter, and how many Jovian days are there in a Jovian year? Because all we see is like, oh, it takes this many years for Jupiter to go around the sun. That's our years, not Jupiter's years. Jupiter takes 1 year to go around the sun, its own. Um, and so I'm also like, don't want to use any words that have any kind of relationship to human beings because we can't even fathom what it's like to be on Jupiter, much less like exist there. So yeah, I still want to write it, but I want to slowly remove my human like sentimentality from the process.
Yeah, I really like that idea, and I think that a lot of us who have gone through an undergrad, both of us who have to some degree or another done graduate work and then writing in the professional field, there's this point to where, and I feel you would have more authority to speak on this, but talking about disembodiment, I've never felt more outside of myself and existing through my laptop at this point. And I'm not even much of a social media person. I'll post like pictures of my cat and stuff,
Mhm.
but um just that living that experience outside of yourself and on the text on a page. And even, I mean, because I've told my students this, I'm like, look, like not every writing assignment is going to be personally inspired, but it's still going to be of yourself. It's still, you know, a million people could write a paragraph about how they started their day, and I'm pretty sure the uniqueness would be in the high percentile. So what I want to move forward toward from this, and just kind of briefly, we've talked about this sense of estrangement from the self, leaning into the self, and really just the different ways in which we can write. I'm curious more so as we consider you're in Lawrence, Kansas, so pretty far from where we would traditionally expect a literary scene. And what I mean by that and what I'm speaking to is the anniversary you recently
Mm.
did. And considering disembodiment for better or worse, living through the screen, living in a very different social landscape, what is your sense of discourse community within this sort of expanded field of literature that you're working in? You work with Mike Correo. I'd imagine Mike Correo, I don't know where Mike Correo lives, but
Minneapolis.
Minneapolis, so pretty far from where you are. So part of what we discuss in my class is just the sense of belonging
Hmm.
and the sense of having your own vocabulary and standards when you're going through different modes of being in your day to day. You know, the way that you talk to your friends is far different from the way you talk to family or superiors or anything like that. Have you thought about what advantages and limitations there might be to operating in the writerly space with such a distance? Because I think that when we traditionally think of any artistic space or artistic scene, we usually think of major metropolitan cities.
Well, one, I don't know if this is benefit, but it just happened to be my life. So, one of the things that has happened for me is that I wrote an entire book and a half of another book, or the duration of half of another book, before I ever like even spoke to my first peer as a writer. Like I wrote plats like entirely divorced from any kind of literary community because I think I felt like that's what writers did.
Right.
Like, just what are you going to do? You sit down and you write a book, and then it's over, and then you try to get it published. I didn't even really know that there was such a thing as a community, and I've talked about that a lot uh, in other conversations. But so I think that it was hard and kind of depressing um, because like my family and stuff didn't really like connect with what I was doing. So the people around me um, who like my friends and stuff were not interested in what I was writing. Um, or I didn't give them the chance to be disinterested, maybe is more appropriate. So I think coming at it from that background of being isolated as a writer, the idea of like being in pretty close to the geographic center of the United States and far away from what people would consider the scenes or whatever, like actual physical locations, it doesn't really bother me. I don't like lament that distance of being isolated and that in fact I feel like it's kind of empowering to me because I don't have like I think I have a big ego inside, but I don't have like a strong personality to like um, become like someone in a big city.
Right.
So like again, with all the stuff I was saying earlier about having no stakes, being in a city that, for all intents and purposes, has no like literary scene, at least not one that I have much interest in engaging with. Um, it's empowering because I don't have to care about that. Like I don't have anyone to impress. Um, so I can just do what I want to do. Um, but I still love talking to people and, you know, texting with writers who I've become friends with. And the the event that you talked about at my place in May with the 10th anniversary of Inside the Castle, it was the first time I had met most of those people. Grant Meyerhofer, who I've been working with for like 8 years or something since his first book with me, I'd never even spoken to him on the phone.
Oh,
Like,
wow.
yeah, like we never Zoomed or even talked on the phone. We text all the time, but I had heard his voice on podcasts, but I never met him, never like had a conversation with him. And then there he was staying at my house um, with Michael Klein, and we just like sat in my basement and shot the shit for hours. And like, um, but the event itself was like, because I don't have any obligations or stakes or like interest in um, creating a scene or like posturing or whatever. I just wanted it to be the way that I wanted it to be. Like, this is like my wedding. Like, my wife and I got married without anyone standing in between us. Like, I didn't want an officiant or anything. I just wanted to talk to her. Um, so this was like that. I did it the way I wanted to do it. Me and my wife made dinner for breakfast, or I'm sorry, breakfast for dinner to feed everybody. It was in my barn that is like half finished. It was very intimate, and I don't know how the people who were there would operate in other spaces, like if they went to a reading in New York or something. Um, but everybody being there in that place in a field in the middle of nowhere, um, were just so warm, so supportive, so genuine and kind, that to me it's like spoiled me forever of like ever doing anything like related to literature in person again, because like it could never be topped. It was just beautiful.
That's gosh, I was already upset that I didn't make it out to it.
No, sorry.
um, so just to put a convenient bow on everything, and this is going up on YouTube, so I think it's going up somewhere. I don't know where yet, but it's definitely going to my class, and I think it's going to be really funny for anyone who views this or listens to this without who are not my students, because every now and then it's just going to be this like, oh, so tying it back to first year composition. So I mean, for especially for young people, but I guess for anybody who has to write at any capacity, what might be some, I don't know that I want to say like advice or anything like that because it's so cliche, but just like parting thoughts.
Yeah, I was very taken when you talked about your mechanical engineering student that you have in writing, and um, trying to imagine what the most advantageous but also like exciting way for a mechanical engineering student to think about writing would be, because it makes me sad to think that there's so many people out there who think that there is a mode that they need to be working in that's like basically been handed down for a couple hundred years of like, the way we speak, the way we have linear time, the way we think a text is supposed to say something, um, and not feeling like they can use text and letters and words as raw material to play with, like in their own way. And so, thinking about a mechanical engineer, like, what is it about mechanical engineering that excites them? Why did they want to go into that discipline? And how can those things that excite them about their own discipline excite them about writing too? Because that is what excites me about writing, is understanding it through the lens of who I am as a professional, which is an architect. And um, of course, it's evolved over 20 something years of writing, but it always goes back to that. Like, I was trained, my brain is like wired as an architect. That was the formative time of my life, and I can't not look at writing through that. Um, but you have to unencumber yourself from what you think the people who write normally's expectations are of you, and just be like, listen, that's not me. I'm interested in this, and I'm going to see what happens when I let myself do that.
I think that's a perspective that I hope isn't unique to our experience in DIY culture, but I think that's kind of the, I don't know, almost like the modus operandi of anybody that I've spoken to that started out in like DIY shows, releasing records, playing in bands, whatever. And honestly, like a lot of people who ended up going into academia, like Steve Heritage is some sort of scientist now.
Are you serious?
Yeah, I'll send you the article on it. It's pretty
uh,
funny. And then you
Good
have
for
Wright, wrote the greatest grindcore record and dropped off
him.
the face of the earth. And then even like the drummer Max Ward from Spaz teaches like Japanese film and history and stuff like that. So, all right, this is going to be the end of this part of the recording. I appreciate anybody who has listened. I'll probably do like a quick postscript